And now the Deeper Thinking podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. We begin with a paradox. In a time of information saturation, forgetting feels like a betrayal, a lapse, a flaw. We're conditioned to clutch everything, facts, images, notifications, as if memory were proof of presence. But what if this constant retention is a misreading of intelligence? What if the ability to forget is not cognitive failure, but a subtle form of wisdom? Intelligence, in its truest form, might not be about storage, but selection. Not about hoarding every shard of experience, but knowing what to leave behind. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche described active forgetting not as a defect, but as a necessary precondition for freedom. Without it, he argued, we become overburdened, too full of context to act. Forgetting, then, is not passive. It is a deliberate, even ethical process of unburdening. The culture of perpetual documentation, of voice memos, cloud backups, tagged photos, gives the illusion that remembering everything makes us more complete. But we risk mistaking recall for depth. What if the act of forgetting is how we make space for insight? The Borges story of Funes the Memorious haunts this question. Funes could not forget a single detail, and for that reason he could not think. Every experience stayed raw, undifferentiated, unanalyzed. Without forgetting, he could not generalize or abstract, and without abstraction, he could not learn. In that sense, forgetting becomes the condition for understanding, a prelude to synthesis. This idea unsettles us. We like our intelligence to be neat and knowable, like a hard drive. But consciousness is not a database, it is more like a tide. Memories wash in, and if they do not retreat, they stagnate. We are not made to carry everything. Emotional clarity, too, often requires release. The pain of an old wound softens not through perfect remembrance, but through partial forgetting, edges blurred by time, details smudged by healing. Sometimes we only become ourselves by forgetting versions of ourselves we once performed. In this light, forgetting is not just mental, it is existential. It grants us narrative permission to change. So what if forgetting is a form of care, not just for ourselves, but for the world? In choosing what to forget, we also choose what to honour, what to remember in sharper relief. Every forgetting is also a remembering by contrast, a receding shoreline that makes the contours of what remains more vivid. In this sense, forgetting is not absence, it is a kind of attention, a subtraction that clarifies. The myth of the perfect memory is seductive. It promises mastery, a safeguard against loss, a defense against confusion. But hidden within that promise is a kind of violence, the assumption that meaning improves with precision, that life is best understood when nothing slips away. Yet anyone who has lived through grief knows that forgetting is not always a failure to remember, but the body's quiet insistence that some memories are too sharp to hold continuously. Forgetting becomes a form of mercy, an emotional recalibration that lets us carry on without breaking. If we remembered everything, we would drown in the granular, we would be trapped in the minute, unable to breathe beyond it. Cognitive science has long explored the brain's tendency to distort or erase detail as a bug in the system, but increasingly there is recognition that memory is constructed, not retrieved. We do not play back the past, we recreate it in the present. The gaps and edits are not glitches, they are features. Adaptive, fluid, and often necessary for coherence, a kind of narrative intelligence, one that knows the story must make sense even if the facts do not. From this view, forgetting is not a collapse of truth, but a rebalancing, a way for the mind to preserve its integrity when exactness would be too much. This is not to glorify ignorance or celebrate inattention. It is to challenge the binary that positions memory as good and forgetting as bad. In many indigenous traditions, forgetting is not an erasure but a letting go, a way to return knowledge to the land, the sky, the story, rather than keeping it confined to the individual. In such frameworks, forgetting is relational. It is an act of humility. To forget, then, might be a way of stepping back from possession, of allowing meaning to breathe without being owned. As the digital world turns every keystroke into an artifact and every image into a timestamp, the act of forgetting becomes a quiet rebellion. Not forgetting because we are careless, but because we choose not to be tethered, because we recognize that permanence can be a trap, that some truths only emerge when we stop trying to hold everything still. In this light, forgetting becomes an epistemic ethic, a refusal to believe that meaning must always be preserved in full. A belief instead that sometimes what matters most is what slips the net, what lingers not as data, but as echo. There's a quiet intelligence in knowing what to forget. Not everything deserves to be remembered. Some details become noise, some hurts become shadows, and some narratives no longer serve who we are becoming. This isn't denial, it's discernment. The mind, when left to its own rhythms, often knows what to loosen. But the systems we've built, search engines, infinite archives, the algorithmic past, intervene. They remind us constantly, sometimes cruelly. A tagged photo from a decade ago, a memory alert you didn't ask for. We've outsourced so much of our remembering to machines that we no longer practice forgetting. And in doing so, we lose part of our humanity. To forget is not to erase, but to allow for change. It is what makes growth possible. Imagine a tree that remembered every storm, every drought, every pruning. It would never extend another branch. We too require amnesia to move forward. Not reckless forgetting, but forgiving forgetting, the kind that recognizes something has been lived, learned from, and now belongs elsewhere. Even language carries this. To forget shares a root with to get, as in to grasp, but in reverse. To let go of the grasping. To release the grip of what once felt essential but no longer is. There is also a politics to forgetting. Who gets to forget and who is forced to remember? For some, forgetting is a privilege, enabled by systems that protect them from consequence. For others, it is denied, history etched into the body, into law, into the names of streets and the silences of textbooks. This raises an ethical tension. Forgetting cannot be universalized. It must be contextualized. It can be intelligent, but it can also be evasive. What matters is the relationship we have with our own forgetting, whether it's used to heal, to repress, or to make space for what still needs to be remembered better. Ultimately, forgetting is not the opposite of knowing. It is how knowledge evolves. Through forgetting, we make room for reinterpretation. Through forgetting, we unmoor from fixed narratives, and through forgetting, we rediscover the present, not as a prison of all that has come before, but as a field of possibility. We are not meant to be libraries. We are not meant to be archives. We are bodies in time, letting the essential rise and the rest dissolve. Forgetting, then, may be one of our most honest acts. It tells the truth, not of what was, but of what now matters. Perhaps the deepest intelligence of forgetting lies in its refusal to repeat. Memory loops, it seeks pattern, resemblance, warning, but forgetting breaks sequence. It releases us from the compulsive reenactment of pain. It interrupts the algorithm of self-definition. So many of us carry identities built on rehearsed memory, what we've survived, what we've achieved, what we've been told. Forgetting cracks that continuity. It makes the self less solid, more fluid. And in that looseness, new ways of being can emerge. Not every past needs to be integrated. Some things can simply be left, and in leaving, a different kind of truth appears, one that doesn't require proof, only presence. The modern obsession with self-tracking, memory capture, and bioanalytics often obscures this. We've built a culture that frames forgetting as inefficiency, that worships the quantified self and treats lost data as lost self. But human meaning doesn't work like that. We are interpretive creatures, not storage devices. What gives life coherence isn't perfect call, but interpretive grace. The ability to shape, reshape, and sometimes to blur. Even the way we recall loved ones changes over time, not because we fail them, but because they continue to live differently inside us. Memory is dynamic. Forgetting is part of its rhythm. In dreams, forgetting is often what allows revelation, the slipping detail, the missing thread, the strange familiarity of a scene we can't quite place. The unconscious speaks in forgotten language, and perhaps that is where the intelligence of forgetting lives most vividly, not in what we lose, but in what we access by losing. The sacred, the poetic, the unfinished. To forget is not to empty the mind, but to make it porous, to let in what cannot be summoned directly. A kind of reverence, then, for what resists retention. In spiritual traditions, Forgetting is sometimes woven into rituals of renewal, a symbolic washing away, a forgiveness of debts, a laying down of burdens. Even the Sabbath in one reading is a weekly forgetting of labor, of striving, of becoming, a return to being. In this way, forgetting becomes cyclical, not an endpoint, but a rhythm, a pulse in the life of the mind and spirit. So we return to the question, what if forgetting is not failure but intelligence, not loss but evolution? The refusal to retain everything may be our most sophisticated adaptation, a resistance to the tyranny of permanence, a surrender to the wisdom of impermanence. Not everything needs to be remembered. Some things are sacred precisely because they are allowed to fade. In this light, forgetting becomes a form of authorship. Each omission is an editorial choice, conscious or not. The mind, like a sculptor, chisels meaning not only by what it includes, but by what it removes. We rarely consider how forgetting gives shape to memory, that without erasure there is no emphasis. Just as silence gives music its phrasing, forgetting gives thought its contours. The act of remembering becomes meaningful only because forgetting is always possible. To recall everything would be to recall nothing in particular. It is the very instability of memory that makes it vivid, emotional, alive. Our technologies, however, are built on the opposite premise. The cloud does not forget. The feed retrieves endlessly. We are offered on this day reminders that replay our history with no room for discernment. There's no editorial sense in the algorithm, no forgiveness, no silence. And in this architecture, we are taught to mirror its logic, to catalogue the self exhaustively, to preserve every moment, to render experience into content. But what if intelligence lies elsewhere? In the ability to allow forgetting to do its quiet work, in the courage to let some chapters unrecorded, unsummarized. Forgetting, then, is not neglect. It is a practice, a capacity to live without a perfect record. It does not oppose memory, but balances it. Like rest balances effort. Like shadow gives shape to light. There's a dignity in knowing when not to look back, in choosing not to re-enter a pain just because it can be retrieved. This doesn't mean avoidance, it means proportion. And proportion, in both architecture and thought, is a mark of intelligence. The spaciousness to not be ruled by what was. In a deeper sense, forgetting is how we become available to the present. If memory is a language of the past, forgetting is the syntax of now. It clears the page. It softens the grip of identity. It allows encounter, real encounter, not just recognition. Because when we remember too much, we stop seeing. We anticipate, we project, we fill in what isn't there. But when we forget, even briefly, we return to attention. We listen more closely. We touch more gently. We see more freshly. This is the intelligence we often overlook. The intelligence of absence, of making space, of understanding that the mind, like a garden, thrives not by holding on to every seed, but by letting some drift into the wind. There is, too, a metaphysical humility in forgetting. It reminds us that we are not the sole keepers of truth, that the world does not depend on our remembering for its continuity. In fact, much of what we forget returns elsewhere, in the body, in the culture, in the dream. We are not isolated vessels of memory, but participants in a wider ecology of remembering and release. The stories we forget may be remembered by others. The histories we lay down may be taken up by the next hand. Forgetting, then, is not abandonment, it is trust. A quiet faith in continuity that does not require personal possession. This loosening of memory can also be a loosening of control. And control often is what drives the fear of forgetting. If we forget, we worry we'll lose the thread of who we are. But perhaps that thread was always a little looser than we pretended. Perhaps forgetting reveals a self that isn't a single line, but a tapestry, one that can be rewoven, remade, even unravelled without being destroyed. To forget is to admit that selfhood is porous, that we are shaped as much by what escapes us as by what we retain. In the context of collective memory, this becomes especially poignant. Societies too forget, sometimes destructively, erasing histories, silencing voices, but sometimes necessarily laying down enmities, dissolving the residue of violence, making room for repair. Not all forgetting is healing, but no healing happens without some forgetting. There is an art to forgetting well, an ethic of what to carry and what to let dissolve, and this art, like all arts, resists automation. It is relational, tender, specific. So we might begin to see forgetting not just as personal, but as civilizational, a tool not of erasure, but of reorientation, of choosing which patterns to continue and which to disrupt. The systems that threaten to remember everything, governments, platforms, corporations, are not more intelligent. They are more anxious. Their obsession with memory is a symptom of their insecurity. True intelligence might look more like the person who lets something slip without panic, who allows the past to breathe, who does not mistake retention for wisdom. To forget, then, is not to be broken. It is to be free from the compulsion to hold it all. It is to live closer to the truth that most of life is not remembered, and yet it mattered. That meaning does not come from endless recall, but from the quiet grace of what remains. And what remains is not always what we expected. Sometimes the most significant moments are the ones we never tried to remember. A glance, a gesture, the way the light fell on a certain afternoon. These survive not through deliberate effort, but through resonance, through some mysterious alignment between experience and need. Forgetting, in this way, becomes a filter for meaning, not a failure of memory, but a deeper form of memory, the kind that chooses us rather than the other way around. It keeps what speaks, it lets go of what has gone silent. This is the intelligence of forgetting. It does not fight time, it moves with it. It recognizes that permanence is a fantasy, and that clinging too tightly to memory can distort the very meaning we're trying to preserve. We remember best when we are not afraid to forget. When memory is not an archive, but a rhythm, a returning. And when forgetting is not shameful, but spacious, allowing us to carry less, and in doing so, to notice more. Forgetting carves the negative space that lets the shape of our lives appear. We might think here of the Japanese concept of mu, emptiness, not as lack, but as potential. Forgetting creates such emptiness. It is not a hole, but an opening, an allowance for something new to enter. A rest note in the song, a blank page that invites a different kind of ink. Intelligence, then, is not just what we know, but what we can unknow, what we are willing to unfix, what we are able to hold, without clenching. The most evolved mind may not be the one that stores the most, but the one that can let go with grace. Even grief teaches this. The moment we begin to forget the sharpest details, the exact sound of a voice, the precise rhythm of a step, we mourn again, but we also adapt. Our remembering becomes more impressionistic, more spacious, and perhaps more enduring. Not every detail survives, but something deeper does. A texture, a presence, a knowing that is not visual, but visceral. Forgetting makes this possible. It clears the high-definition footage so that something softer, more lasting can stay. So let us not treat forgetting as absence. Let us recognize its intelligence, its timing, its subtle ethics. It is not always a gap to be feared. Sometimes it is the space in which the next moment finds room to exist. Not everything must be held. Not everything must be named. Some truths arrive only when the page has been turned. Some insights emerge only in the pause. Forgetting, finally, may be not what breaks us, but what makes space enough to begin again. If we reframe forgetting as a beginning rather than an end, we open ourselves to a different kind of intelligence, one that is not defensive, not preservationist, but creative. Forgetting can be the threshold through which reinvention steps quietly forward. It can be the door that was never locked, only waiting. In a world obsessed with performance, with certainty, with holding the right information at the right moment, forgetting becomes a transgression. A refusal to perform cognitive obedience, a kind of epistemic softness that says, I do not need to know everything to be whole. And what might we build from this space? A way of relating that does not rely on keeping score. A culture less fixated on archival proof and more attuned to presence. A philosophy not of total knowledge, but of lived understanding. When we forget, we return to the moment, to the breath, to the person in front of us, unfiltered by yesterday's image. There's an intimacy possible here that memory in its possessiveness can sometimes obscure. To forget is to allow a second encounter to be first again. It is the ethical stance of letting someone be different from who we remembered. Even the most rigorous thinkers have flirted with this kind of forgetting. Simone Weil wrote that attention at its highest form is a kind of prayer. But to attend fully, one must sometimes forget what one expects to see, to unknow, to meet the world not with a mind full of conclusions, but with an openness to be changed. Forgetting here is not the opposite of attention, it's its condition, a clearing of the perceptual path, an invitation to notice what wasn't on the list. This is the paradox at the heart of forgetting. It is both emptying and enrichment, loss and renewal. We think we are less without all our memories, but perhaps we are more agile, more honest, more available to mystery. We have confused remembering with mastery, but real understanding often arrives through release, through the echo, not the imprint, through the shape left behind when something vanishes. So what if we ended not with a conclusion, but with a permission? To let the mind be imperfect, to let meaning be fluid, to honour forgetting not as a lapse but as a craft, a discipline of discernment, a gift of renewal. We are not diminished by what we forget, we are remade by it. There is intelligence in every unremembered thing, if only we learn to listen to the space it leaves behind. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.